Hey everyone, how's it going? Thanks for joining us on this episode of Connectors Live. And today, what we're really going to be focusing on talking about is how we can take a connector that we've already built and start moving it from how it was working locally to a production environment. So, we're going to walk through all the steps, starting with a fully built connector that's running, and we'll walk through getting it into production and then how we can start automating things. So, when we make changes, updates, everything kind of just works into getting to our hosted router. So let me switch over to my next screen and let's talk a little bit about our starting point. So I have a connector on the screen. This is actually one from one of our past episodes that's going to be showing the Strappy and Stripe instance. So we have our fully built out connector. Right now, we're just kind of pointing at our local Strappy instance. We have our Stripe right here. I have everything running in the background. So if I switch over to our sandbox, you can see I'm getting some data back. Everything's all good, right? So we have that connector running locally. Now, we're going to be hosting everything today in Railway. So I've created a project for us to add these services into. And one of the nice things I like about Railway is it works off of Docker files. We ship the router binary as a Docker image, so it's really nice, easy to work with. And it's pretty common using Docker images for a lot of modern deployments. So we're going to walk through and set that up. So I'm going to head over to VS Code where our project is. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up that Docker file. So we're going to create a new file. Create a new file, put that Docker file in, and it's pretty simple of what we want to have. We're basically pulling the router image. So latest one right now is 2.1. You can check out our docs to find out which version is. There'll be more versions that happen after this episode, I'm sure. And then we're basically copying over the router configuration. And that's this router YAML file that's inside of here. So this is one of the things that configures the router. In our Stripe integration, we have to provide an API key. We have that configuration value put here. Just to show where that is, if we went into our connector and we looked at Stripe, you'll see we have these headers that we have to send. Now I'm sending over the authorization as bearer. You may also have a world where you're actually just trying to pass through the authorization header from your router to whatever your connector service is. I left that here commented out, so we can just talk about that really quickly. So you're really going to have one or two of these scenarios. I'm either going to be passing my token through, or I'm going to be wanting to, maybe use a generalized token. So for Stripe, I actually have a read-only token for the prices that I have configured into this world. Now, once we have this Docker file set up, this is kind of what we need to get our router hosted. But the next thing we need to do is we need to start setting up our router's configuration to handle all of our different environments and things like that. And really one thing that I think about is, our Strappy instance, it's running locally, and I'm executing requests that locally, but once we push in the cloud, that's not going to work. And also when we think about different environments, we're going to production right now, but there's staging, multiple environments that we might be setting things up for. And so we're going to want this URL to be dynamic. So there's a couple things we need to do. First, we're going to go into our router YAML. And for Railway requires that the router actually listens on an environment variable port. And that's because of how they set things up, dynamic environment variable for the port that it's listening to. So we can do that by setting up the supergraph and changing the listen port to 000. And this is where we can go ahead and use n.port. Now, we also may want to default that. So right now it already defaults to 4,000. So when I put that in, I save the file, you can see now that it's running on 4,000. That's the default. But if I set that environment variable, we're all good to go. So now we're ready for one of the requirements that Railway has in hosting inside of there. The next thing is, we have this configuration for Stripe. And for Stripe, we're just pointing at that production API endpoint. But we also want to do something for our Strappy instance. And for that, we actually have the override URL that we want to do. And so very similar, we want to have this actually listen to a environment variable. And we can default this if we wanted to that localhost 1337, which is the default for where Strapi is hosted. But what this really does is this provides us the ability to set an environment variable for wherever we're hosting our router and have that change what that URL is. So you can now imagine that I might have multiple routers hosted in production, staging. For each of those, I'm able to put where that URL is for my staging, the environment that Strapi instance is actually hosted in. So I want to give a little flavor of what it might look like of pointing at a third-party API where maybe you have a staging environment, maybe you don't for that, and then what it would look like for your internal resources that you do have a staging and production environment for. Now, I've already published all of this into a GitHub repository. So we have right here this GitHub repository, but we have some changes we just made. And we can see here we are. I have my Docker file. It says it's empty, so it looks like I didn't actually save that file. I should save that. So we have our Docker file. We have our router file with the changes inside of there. And I'm going to create a new branch, and I'm going to just call it to production. We'll bring our changes with us. And let's publish these changes, right? So this we'll just call it MVP. I call a lot of things MVP. And we'll just publish that branch. So we have our branch up and available in GitHub now. And now that we've done that, we can go back to Railway and we can start to add a service. But there's one thing I want to point out. You can even see, and this is very common in all of your hosting providers, you can already see they start to talk about environments, and they've already called this default setup a production environment. So what I want to do is I want to actually match all of this with what's going on in my GraphOS account. So when we first set up our connectors project and everything, we would have a graph in here. This is the exact graph of what you would have had just going through the create a new option. If we looked at the schema inside of here, oh, my internet is going a little slow for us today. Well, the schema that's in here, there we go, is just the simple schema that's actually coming from our quick start and everything, right? So we just have everything from the very basic point. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this schema. I'm going to go into the settings, and under this graph, we have these variants. And this is where we can create different variants. And what I like to do is I think of a variant as an environment in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a variant. I'm going to call this production. Click continue. Now our connector doesn't have a endpoint. I'm just going to put products in here. We're going to call our subgraph name products. Under advanced options, we can provide a schema. So I'm actually just going to paste that in here. And we can scroll down, click this upload button, and add a new variant. So just kind of from the get-go, I'm just setting up these environment variables for what I have in the environments that I'm working at. And so I have my production variant. Perfect, right? So now we have everything we need in GraphOS kind of set up, and we're going to match everything to this production variant. Now, the next thing we need to do is go back to Railway, and let's start adding in our service. So I'm going to connect to the GitHub repo. I've already configured my GitHub application. You can see my internet is already still going a little slow from the stream. Oh, that just popped up. There we go. Connectors live. Okay. And you can see here's the details. I have everything that's going on that's going to be deployed. And I can click this deploy, or what I like to do with Railway is actually set up a lot of my settings. So the first thing is if I come in here, I'm actually going to deploy this off of that to production branch, just so we can kind of work through this, and we'll eventually switch it over to the main branch. But as we can walk through the steps, And there's a couple other things we need to do. We need to set a couple environment variables. So we're going to need to set some of these variables inside of here. And one of them is our GraphOS key. So I always think it's a best practice for us to create a environment variable specific for your hosted router inside of that, or I said environment variable, API key specific for your router. So if we go back to GraphOS and go into API keys, I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this router production. And I'll copy that API key, come back into here, and we'll add a new variable. Oops, this is Apollo key. And we've added that. Now, I also need to say what graph reference I'm going to be pointing at. So I'm going to create a new variable, Apollo graph ref, and the ID, which is CL product catalog. It's going to be that, and then at production. All right. So we've added those two. Now we have a couple more. One, we have that Stripe API key that we need to add in here. So I already created that in the background. So I'm going to just, paste that in here. And then we have the Strappy URL. So that's that URL of what's being hosted. So for this, I'm actually going to want to point at the production hosted version of my Strappy instance. So I'm going to add that in there. And with that, we're just going to click this deploy button. It's going to apply all these changes and start rolling into that deployment. So we can see that initialized right here. I can open up the logs. It's going to start going through, what is its build process inside of there. And then we should see from the output of the logs, that hosted service for us. I'm going to refresh my page because it looks like my internet's just going a little slow for all this. I wonder what details you're saying haven't been deployed. Okay. So some of my UI is a little funky, but you can see right here, here's everything that loaded up. So this is great. Our router looks like it started up. We have everything. Now, you can see it has a GraphQL endpoint exposed at 8080. We also have a health check endpoint at 8088. That's kind of a nice thing that you automatically get. And our next step is to actually expose this. So we want to expose this on the public internet so we can access it. And I'm just going to refresh this page because I did deploy it, and we should see that option now. All right, I'm just going to say deploy since it's forcing me to say that. Looks like it didn't catch two of my changes. Okay, all right. So now we're redeploying. This is sometimes happens. The unexpected with your hosting provider inside of that. It's never a good live episode unless something doesn't work just perfectly as we're going along. And I always have some internet issues, and this is part of streaming. Okay, all right. So now we have this hosted. Now I bet if we go to the settings, we're going to have, here we go. So the generate domain option. Now we can select the port. So we said it was running on 8080, and we can generate our domain for this. Okay, so here's our domain. If I click that, you can see this is the default router landing page. Now, this looks different than when you're running things locally. When you run the router locally with Rover Dev, it's actually running the router in dev mode, which turns a bunch of things on, for development purposes. But by default, when you run the router, it actually runs in production mode. So it disables a lot of things like a page to go access, what is the schema, all of those type of things. But we can take this URL. This is where our hosted version is. We can come back to GraphOS. If we look at our production variant, and I actually don't need to look at the settings. Well, as my internet is just really slowly crawling along, what we're going to do is we're going to take that URL and we're going to set it in our instance. So you can see this graph doesn't add an endpoint, add one in the connection settings. And so we can actually add that endpoint right here. So this is the connection settings for our production variant. So we're now kind of linking up. And what GraphOS provides is an Apollo Explorer instance. So the schema that we had defined in there, really simple, which was part of the quick start, is all inside of here. Now, you notice that it gets things like subgraph errors redacted and information in there. This is what one of the things the router does when it's running production mode. We don't bubble any subgraph errors up or anything like that. Now, we're not even pointed at like our connector or anything yet. I just wanted to walk through getting a router hosted with, the stuff we have in there. So now that we have our URL set in GraphOS and everything, what we need to do next is actually publish our schema into GraphOS. So if we go back to real quick, actually, before I do that, let me grab this API key. And let's go back to VS Code. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use the Rover CLI. We're going to set our Apollo key. And then we're going to do Rover subgraph publish. And then from that Rover subgraph publish, we have a couple things that we need to do. One, we have to say what variant we want to publish to. So we're going to do that CL product catalog at production. We're going to change the name. So that was products. We have to point at that schema, which was just that connector.graphql file. There's a routing URL. This, we just had, I like to just put it as the name of what that connector is because we have that routing URL being overridden in that configuration. So I'm going to execute that. It's going to go through and publish that. Now, if we head back over to GraphOS, there's a couple things we're going to see. So one, we have this launches tab. And so when you run that command, it actually initiates what we call a launch. That's where we're going to take that new schema. If there's other connectors or other GraphQL APIs that you have in the mix, it's going to compose all that together, run some checks, and it's going to publish that schema for our router to hot reload. And if we come back into our deployed router and look at the logs, you'll notice that it actually restarted. This reload complete happened. So if we go back into GraphOS and we look at that Explorer, now this products works, but really we can just take this exact query we had right here, paste that in here, boom. Now we're getting data that's coming back from that production instance and everything, right? And we're right here in GraphOS. Here we can see that query plan with the connectors and everything. Now, you'll notice you don't have the connectors debugger here. And a big reason for that is because the router is not running in development mode. The router only exposes that connectors debugger when we're running in development mode. So I want to just call that out. I think it's an important thing to understand because it's part of the security aspects of the router. We don't want that running in production. If someone looked at it, they could see the headers from Stripe request and actually get that API key, What I'm talking about, so if we looked at that local instance, what connector debugger has right here, if I look at the Stripe request, I could see right here in my headers of that request coming through. So there's that token that I was talking about. All right. So as we're moving into production, we're slowly ensuring that these things are set up in a right way. We're not leaking any information. And that's kind of what the router does by default. So now that we've kind of set up our graph, we've published everything into the world. Now we want to start looking at, okay, how do we start automating things? And what I really think about like the automation is like, how do we do this in CI/CD? So when I make changes to that GitHub repository, everything just works. Now we do have some great talks. We have some GitHub actions, and that's what we're going to use today to control this. This is a great example. We have a Rover Actions GitHub action that you can use to go through. And the first thing we're going to want to do is just set up the ability to check a schema. And this is something that happens on every push and pull request in this example. So I'm going to copy this file. Let's go back to VS Code. Minimize this window. And if we're going to create the .github folder, then inside of there, we have the workflows folder. And then we'll just create a checks.yaml file. And we'll paste that file in. And let's just talk about this real quick. So we have, and on every push and pull request, this job is going to run. We have a single job we're calling build. You can see that we have our Apollo key. That's going to be important here. So we're going to need to set some environment variables up for our GitHub repository. And then we're just doing some simple stuff. We're just checking it out, our repo. We're installing the Rover CLI through that Rover actions that we have. And then we're running what's called subgraph check. And we need to point at a couple things. So one, when we're checking a change to one of our schemas of whatever we're doing, we can point at different graph refs. So, those environments we might want to point at, right now we're just going to be pointing at that production one, but there might be different ones. This is where you really have the flexibility. One of the common patterns I see is sometimes making branches for the environments in your repository and actually using those branch names as part of what this graph ref that's getting created. So you can actually create a GitHub action variable that is pulling that all together. We set our subgraph name for this is products. And then the path to the schema is just that connector.graphql. Now, what I think about when I start building out connectors, I've gotten a couple questions of this from different companies I've been working with. How should we handle connectors? Should we just have one file? Should we have multiple files? Like, how should we handle this? Really the way I think about it is I probably would have a single file that's going to be associated with like an API or a domain. Here, we're doing a product catalog as our example. So this is like our products domain. And it's all contained in one single GitHub repository. If I was going to add another, I'd probably create another GitHub repository and do something similar. You definitely can do both options. It's really going to be up to you and what works best for the makeup of your team, how you have your project set up. But this is kind of giving you the flexibility to change those things as needed. So now that we've kind of copied this file in here, we know we need to set up this Apollo key and Apollo graph ref. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back to our settings in GraphOS. I think it's also important that we create a GitHub action API key. I like to keep my API keys separate every chance I get. Then we can come into the settings for our GitHub repository. And then under secrets and variables, we have actions here. And this is where we're going to set up our secrets. So this is our Apollo key. We'll add that secret. And then we have the Apollo graph ref. And we're going to make this at production for now. Right. And so what I was talking about is if you wanted to do something dynamic with that environment variable, you might leave this off and use as far as a GitHub action variable to take that branch name and mirror that into here. really depends on what you want to check against. Some teams definitely run their checks against a pre-production environment. Very common workflow inside of that. So I have my repository secrets set up inside of here now. One of the other things I've done, and this is more, I've had this configured for my account forever. I have this Apollo GraphOS inside of here. What this enables us to do is we'll have a little link to our check inside of our pull request inside of here. Not something you have to have. It just kind of adds in, the experience you would expect from a lot of other applications. In that same docs is how you can get that. This is in the marketplace of what we can add in. So I have those two things added into our world. And we now need to see about what it's like to actually push this into our project. So we have our checks. I'm going to actually send it in here. So we create our checks. We're going to publish that up. Now we're going to go through and create a pull request. It opened on the wrong screen. Okay. Test out checks. And we'll create this pull request. And now you can see that this checks. You can see the push already passed. The pull request is starting right now. And this is what's actually running that schema validation. So if we click on this, you can see it's running that check that's actually ensuring that any changes we make to our schema, does it actually break anything? So I want to talk a little bit about what that means. As we start building out our graph, as we start building more client applications and everything, we have people using our graph. We have use cases consuming our graph. We want to make sure a couple things pass. And what we can do is we can actually look at that check details just to dive a little deeper of what it was doing. Might be faster for me to actually just go through the already ran and loaded instance. So you can see here's that check that happened, right? You can see the commit that was associated with it and all the details that are associated. So like there's multiple tasks that run inside of this. This is where we want to check the change we're making, the difference of that. Does it actually break any operations that were already running against our production instance? Were there any linting rules that didn't pass, right? Whether you want camel case, snake case, whatever the details you might have set up inside of here. We want to make sure it's checking all those rules. Now, my internet's just kind of going slow. So in the interest of time, we'll come back to this detailed report as it loads out. But we got our checks passing. That's really the big piece of that. Now, the next thing we need to do is just like checks, we want to have something, but instead we're actually going to have something that publishes the event, right? So I'm actually just going to copy this file and paste it, and we're going to rename this to publish. Okay, so now we're in publish. We'll start changing some of our details. We're going to publish the schema, and this is just like how we ran that rover subgraph publish command. Now, we're not going to want to do this on every pull request. That would not work out for us. But on every push, we're going to want to do a specific set of branches. Now, I'm going to just do main for our example here, since I'm treating my main branch as my production branch, very common. So anytime something gets pushed into our main branch, we're going to want to publish the schema. That's going to update our router. So if any changes to that connector file happens, it's going to get hot reloaded. Now, I already have this already changed to products. I already have connector. And I actually just need to change this one piece to be publish. And that's it. So I'm going to save this file. We'll go back into here. We'll commit this. We'll publish that up. And then we'll come back over to our pull requests. We can see we have new changes, right? So anytime there's a new change that gets pushed to that PR, those checks are rerunning, right? So we now have automated validating any changes to our connector that we might be making over time, which is really, really nice. Now, as this finishes, you can see this is what that Apollo GitHub action is providing. And really, it's just a quick link that takes you directly to that report of what I was showing in that GitHub action. So that's what that GitHub app is actually providing you. Now I'm going to merge this pull request into there. But one of the things I want to do is if we went back to Railway, remember we had pointed this at our specific branch. We actually want to connect our main branch to the production instance. So I'm going to switch that over and just deploy that change. I was about to say, Railway, you want me to click that button 3 times? All right, cool. So that's building out, and it's basically just building off of that new branch. And it looks like, using subdirectory VS Code. That seems strange. Oh, because we haven't pushed the Docker file into that, but that's okay. We actually have everything ready to go. So we can come here and we can just confirm this merge. This is actually going to push everything we need up. I'm going to delete this branch. We should see Railway re-kick off a deploy since we just pushed a change up there. There we go. Now the build should be using that Docker file now that it is available in that main branch. Yep, we can see it's actually pulling that router image right here. All right, and now we have everything deployed. Now, what's really cool about this too is we had this change that happened. If we looked at our actions, here was the merge pull request that's happening, the publish schema, right? And you can see inside of here, the rover subgraph publish that was happening. Now, we didn't have anything get updated because we actually didn't make a change to the schema, and that's totally fine. But you can see that now that rover subgraph publish command we were running at the beginning is now running in our CI/CD operations, which is really cool. So everything is fully automated. As we make a change, what's going to happen in there? And even to the point, if I come into my code, I come into this connector, we were making some queries inside of here. Let's just break some stuff, right? Let's just go into here and let's just say, we are making things off of products no longer exists. Like that shouldn't happen. And let's create a new branch. Never commit directly to main. All right, so we're going to try updating this. We'll see our checks start happening and everything inside of there, right? And so this is what I mean as starting to get to see that check happening immediately when we make a change into our graph. Now, I only ran like one operation against it. I didn't actually have a bunch of client operations or other things inside of there. Typically, you'd have a lot more traffic things, but you can see this build's failing, right? And inside of that build, you can actually see the output of what's going on. So there's actually some traffic, right? We just sent like one operation, but it used that products field. And so we want to see what's going on there. Why is this failure happening? Well, it's because there's a client out there in the wild that's already consuming a portion of our graph. And if we made that change, we're actually going to break their use case. Maybe if I go to this original checks page, no. I don't want to refresh this page, but it looks like, oh, it just popped up. Dang it. My slow internet. Well, we'll let that kind of load up. But the important point here is as we make these changes, we want to make sure that we're validating any of those against that. Now, the last step of what I would do in here for getting ready for my production environment is I'd want to protect my invariant, right? So typically, if we went back to our project in here, if I go into the settings and I look at branches, I might want to add some, right? Or create some protected branches, right? So this is a common pattern of what you do inside of your GitHub repository. Well, I'm going to want to do the same exact thing inside of my graph in GraphOS. And I don't know if my internet's going to let me do this right now. Okay, well, I think my internet is just not going to play nice for this last part of the session. Okay. Yeah. Well, you know, wouldn't be a good live demo unless something was a little up. I hope I haven't been coming through very choppy for everyone with streaming and kind of pulling some of these things together. But what we'll do is we'll make sure that kind of the aspect of these things. Meantime, here we have these protected variants that you can have where you can control like what gets contributed inside of there. That would typically be a world of what we'd want to put in. So this would enable you to have different roles that would maybe control of what's being published into that schema. If you're just a team of one or a team of few, most of the time you don't need to necessarily protect your variant because you're all going to kind of be operating in an admin type of fashion. But with that said, we do have our router hosted. We have everything we need to start making requests to this. And we've kind of set up our environment variables for us. So I hope y'all have really enjoyed this Connectors Live episode. We talked about a couple different things. One, we took an existing local connectors project and we actually took that and hosted it. So that started out with creating a Docker file. We made some configuration things. We ensured that the URLs that are being used for our sources in our connectors are dynamic based off environment variables that are coming from whatever our hosted environment is. We also set up the listening port to work in how Railway expects it, which is an environment variable for that port. And then once we had that set up, we actually set up GraphOS to where we had a production environment our production variant that matched our production environment for Railway. We set up API keys that were specific for that router hosted instance, published everything up into Railway, exposed that endpoint, and then we brought that back into GraphOS so we could start executing requests. That was kind of the first setup. And then last, we set up two GitHub actions. One, to ensure that any changes we're making to our graph, that it's always checked on every pull request that's happening. And then when that pull request is safe and everything get merged into the main branch, we want to make sure that that is updating our production variant. So our GraphOS router hot reloads, and we don't have to redeploy anything into our Railway environment. If you have any questions about this or any thoughts of how should I do this in this environment or how should I do this with this hosting provider, please reach out to us in our community forums at community.apollographql.com. Feel free to ping myself, Watson, any of the teams. We have a connector category that we're more than happy to answer any questions for you inside of there. All right, with that, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.